was speaking at an event in January 2016. It was fun. My wife and I were on an anniversary trip. We went to St. Louis. We had the opportunity to meet some amazing people. The keynote speaker at the same event was Charles Krauthammer. He was a distinguished man. He was brilliant. It was a pleasure to meet him. But another person I met stood out to me. Made a huge impact, and he's become a good friend. I'm talking about an Australian. He's now become an American, but he was born in Australia, and he was one of the youngest politicians in the history of that country. He's a brilliant young man, and we were talking to him about the upcoming election. I had my favorite. I was supporting Senator Ted Cruz. He's my senator from Texas, and I've known Ted since well before he was heavily involved in politics. Good guy. But my new friend, he said there's this businessman out in New York, and everybody had heard of him. We all knew who Donald Trump was, but I thought he was a great businessman, but would he be a good president? Nick was certain. He'd read his books, he'd followed his career. He was absolutely certain that Donald Trump would be a great president, not only that he could be a good president, but that he would win the election. I thought that was a little far-fetched, and I told him so. And we made kind of a gentleman's bet. We didn't bet anything really. He just said, I'll bet you. Guess what? He was right, I was wrong. We're going to talk to Nick Adams here in the Economic War Room, and we're going to be talking about a new book he has out called Trump and Churchill. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Nick to the Economic War Room.
Hello, Kevin. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you. This is your second time in the War Room. We've talked about FLAG, and we've talked about the good work you're doing in schools across the country. But now we want to talk about the book. Tell me, why do you think that we could compare Donald Trump with Winston Churchill?
Well, Donald Trump and Winston Churchill are two incredibly fine leaders, and both, I think, have got a lot in common. Now, you wouldn't know it at first, Kevin. If you just look at the two men, you'll see a lot of differences. You'll see that one's really tall and one was really short. You'll see that one loved to nap in the afternoon and one barely sleeps. You'll see that one is a teetotaler and the other didn't mind a drink or three. So there are lots of differences between them on the surface. But as soon as you start to drill down a little bit more, you find that Winston Churchill and Donald Trump are both very similar.
You know,
both
Nick,
patriots.
if we had had this conversation 4 years ago when we were talking, and you'd made that comparison, I'd have been shocked. I mean, I was like, wait, what? I'm a huge admirer of both men, but I couldn't see Churchill as a businessman, and I couldn't see Trump as president. But you did. You saw something different in Donald Trump. What about this man attracted you to the point that you thought he could be president?
It's a great question, Kevin. It really is, and it's one that I have pondered, obviously, before he was elected and since he's been elected. I read The Art of the Deal when I was a very young boy. I was a teenager still at school, and I was struck by a lot of the content within The Art of the Deal. And there were a lot of things about the personality, the confidence that Donald Trump exuded that I thought was really required after 8 years of President Barack Obama. So on the 16th of June 2015, when President Trump did come down the escalator and I saw him speak, I was immediately moved to support him, because what I felt was that at that particular moment, at that juncture in our history, a normal politician, no matter how articulate, no matter how presentable, no matter how well reasoned, wasn't going to cut it. We needed a sledgehammer. We needed somebody that could really pierce the psyche of Americans. And everything that I knew about Donald Trump up until that moment made me feel that he was the best man for the job. No one can market as well as he can. No one can tap into the sensibilities of the average American like he could, and that's why I thought he was the best man for the job.
Well, you know a little something about politics. In fact, I believe you were the youngest politician in Australia's history. You became deputy mayor, and You know, I think of Spin City, the show where Michael J. Fox character was the deputy mayor. He really ran the city when I think of you. And so tell me, from your political, number one, why'd you get interested in politics? And then number two, from your political standpoint, you know, how did you view the Trump campaign?
Look, I got into politics, Kevin, quite simply because I wanted to help people. I was really young. I was a young man. I'd finished high school. I'd gone to college. I'd done a year of college. And in between the summer, I was called up by some people in the party, in the Conservative Party in Australia, and they said, Nick, there's this opportunity to run. You're probably not going to win, but I tell you what, it's going to be a great experience for you, and the party will be very thankful to you in the future. And when there is a really good seat for you to run in, you're going to be much more looked at for that.
But you won, right?
Well, I did.
Yeah.
I did. I knocked on every door twice, and I was the only person, I think, Kevin, that thought I was going to win. And I did. I ended up winning. And I was really out of a community spirit that I ran. I wanted to help people. I wanted to help people in my community that needed help, older people, younger people, and I always had a heart for that, and that's why I got involved. And it was that grassroots politics that really made me realize what a leader needs in order to be able to connect with a voter. And that's, again, what I saw in Donald Trump. Donald Trump was saying what people were thinking and were too afraid in many instances to say.
Wow. Well, let's talk about that in relation to Churchill, because Churchill had a lot of failure in his political career. I mean, he ultimately led the British Empire through World War II and helped save Western civilization, as you point out in your book. But he had a lot of failure. He didn't always connect, at least not with the political class. So what attracted you to studying Churchill?
Well, so Winston Churchill, a lovable wordsmith, a man that could just cut somebody down with a few words, great wit, incredible orator. He's somebody that I guess I also had an affinity for, because a lot of, I guess, the traits that he kind of, including the bad ones, that he kind of had, I felt that I had an inclination toward as well. You know, I think that Sir Winston Churchill was somebody that really, he was extreme in everything that he did. He probably ate too much. He probably drank too much. And I think that's what makes him so relatable. And then, of course, he loved the English language. He had this unbelievable command of the English language, and all of those things combined made me fascinated by him. It was actually my father that told me to read Churchill's speeches, made me read Churchill's speeches when I was 8 or 9 years old. And so I really kind of got into that. And of course, Australia and England have got a very strong connection. And growing up in Australia, Winston Churchill was obviously a big part of history and the school curriculum, and his involvement in Anzac Day, which was one of his failures, was always taught to us. So I grew up really finding out a lot about Sir Winston, and was very fortunate enough to travel to England multiple times and go to the Churchill War Rooms and really get an even more enhanced feel for him.
Yeah, you know, we've actually designed the economic war room on the concept of the Churchill War Rooms, even down to the fact that we have a vault door on our bunker. We have a Churchill bust here in the war room. So I've been fascinated with Churchill a lot. And we talk about him all the time, too, because he was a master strategist. And we talk about Dunkirk and Operation Dynamo and things like that. So, yeah, I get that. I think it makes sense to study Churchill. And it makes sense, especially, I think, now, when you started writing your book, Donald Trump wasn't a wartime president. But with the COVID-19 virus surrounding the planet and all of the implications, the shortages and then the people sheltering in place, it has a wartime feel to it. And that's something that you hadn't anticipated, I don't think.
No, absolutely not. But you're exactly right. I guess looking ahead, you may have been able to see that both Donald Trump and Winston Churchill are the kind of men, are the kind of leaders that you would want in circumstances like this. and you see how Donald Trump framed this by calling it the invisible enemy. I mean, I think that's very Churchillian. I think that Sir Winston Churchill, faced with similar circumstances, may well have used that kind of language. But we are seeing Donald Trump leading, I think, contrary to everything that the left are trying to tell us and the mainstream media are saying every night over and over again. I think this president is doing an outstanding job. And the one thing, Kevin, I think that is vastly understated and under-recognized at this point is that Donald Trump shut down travel to China almost immediately.
Yes.
And he gets no credit for that.
He was being accused of being a racist.
Precisely.
And the people in New York, Mayor de Blasio and Nancy Pelosi, were all saying, hey, let's go out and hug Chinese people to show we're not racist. Let's gather in crowds in Chinatown, which is obviously the worst possible advice. But shutting down travel, and Dr. Fauci said that made a big difference in slowing the viruses appearing here in this country.
It most certainly did, Kevin. And then another Churchillian thing that Trump did was naming the enemy. And I think that again is something that we missed in the 8 years of Barack Obama. I mean, his administration refused to name Islam, radical Islam, and Islamists by name for what they were doing. This president came out and said, this is the Chinese virus. This virus has begun in China, right. And I'm going to call it that. And what that did was it fortified the American people to know where this came from and what we were up against. And I think, again, by taking such strident, bold moves in shutting down travel, in naming the enemy, in crafting language like the invisible enemy, all of those things are straight out of the Churchill-Trump strategy.
Yep, no, I think that's great. And you're right. I think it's important that we recognize that this is the Wuhan flu or the Chinese coronavirus, or some people I know are calling it the CCP, Chinese Communist Party virus, which is important not because we're trying to blame, but we're trying to acknowledge. I mean, nobody goes back and says it was wrong to say Spanish flu or Ebola, which comes from a region in Africa, or any of those things. But China pushed back, and because they pushed back, it's important that we document it. And the fact that they lied to us initially, and some 95% of the spread would have been reduced had they been honest instead of lying and covering it up in China, there is a culpability there that we will have to address. The world needs to know that we can't fully trust China for everything we do. They are a communist nation after all.
Without a doubt. And I think that President Trump he's made that clear. I think, Kevin, he's going to keep hitting that point because I think he wants the American people to remember this. Because if we go back and have a look, I mean, another great commonality between Trump and Churchill is their prescience. Both men were able to predict what was going to happen. Both men were calling for action before anything actually eventuated. In Churchill's case, it was with the Nazis and Hitler and appeasement and Chamberlain and all that kind of stuff. And with Trump's case, he's been saying forever, I mean, the last 30 years, but particularly the last 3 or 4 years, he's been saying we need to bring manufacturing back.
Right.
We can't rely on China. We can't do this. We can't do that. He ended up being not just right, but right on every single possible level.
Right. And if he had not been president for the last 3 years, we would be in a worse shape, because when he instituted tariffs and when he started jawboning against dependence on China, American corporations began to look for alternatives. And so they've at least had the conversation, what do we do if we don't access China's manufacturing, goods from China and so forth? We at least had the conversation, so we were a little further along than we would have been. I do wish, and we brought this up in the Economic War Room 2 years ago. We brought Rosemary Gibson in and we talked about China RX, how we were dependent on pharmaceuticals. The active pharmaceutical ingredient in most of our medicines has been coming from China, and we raised the issue and we said we've got to build something here now. We tried to get it through the bureaucracy to the president. We were not able to get as far as we wanted, but at least we began the conversations 2 years ago. So in that respect, we've prepared more than we otherwise would have, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, we're very lucky that we had President Trump kind of beginning that process, Kevin, and I think it really has put us in an incredible place right now to recover. And I know recovery right now as we speak is kind of difficult to imagine, because we're all still shut behind closed doors, and many of us are not working, many of us are not even employed right now because of this. But it's important to remember that, like everything, this too will pass.
Yes.
And when it does, I think because of the president's initial greasing us up with all of this stuff relating to China, and now our anger and frustration and disappointment with how China and the Chinese government have behaved, I think that's going to allow us to really rebound very quickly, more quickly than what we may have, and it could possibly lead to us even becoming bigger and stronger and better than what we were before.
Well, I'm very hopeful of that as well. We do need to remember the lesson, though, of Churchill. He was voted out of office after World War II ended, and that was a mistake, I think, for the British Empire. In fact, the British Empire lost traction until Margaret Thatcher came into power from that moment. So we got to remember that lesson. Tell us some more similarities, though. We've talked about the surface differences and some of the surface similarities. I mean, one of the things is that Mike Huckabee said it, basically he said that a lot of people didn't like Churchill because he was blustering and he was rude and he was arrogant and he was all these things. And President Trump has those qualities, but he also has those leadership qualities. What are some of the below the surface qualities that they share?
You know, Kevin, one of the things with leadership is being a good leader. You need to, there are lots of different skills that you need. One is knowing when to follow the experts around you, and one is knowing when to go it alone. And in modern history, I have never ever seen two men like Churchill have that instinct so down pat. Both of them know when to rely on the advice of those around them, and both of them have this instinctive, incredible ability to know when they should back their own judgment over the prevailing judgment around them. I think that's the one that stands out the most to me. The second one is obviously both men love their country. Both men are bold. Both men don't really care what other people think. That's, again, in such a poll-driven world that we live in, that's, again, something that's very unique. I mean, it might not sound all that impressive, but in today's world, for somebody to really not care about drawing criticism if they feel passionately that what they're doing is the right thing, that's moral courage. And I think that both Trump and Churchill have that in spades.
Well, let's talk about Churchill just 1 second in that regard. Churchill loved his country, but he also believed in American exceptionalism, and he loved our country. Tell us a little about, you wrote about that in the book about Churchill's mom and things like that. Tell us a little about his passion for America.
Of course. Well, yes, Sir Winston Churchill, many Americans might be surprised to learn this, but Sir Winston Churchill was half American. His mother was American, and I suspect that's where his affection for the United States began. But it certainly didn't end there. Churchill was a lifelong student of the United States of America. He loved the founding of America. He loved the values of America, the principles of America. He liked the freedom. And, he had many interesting conversations that have been recorded both by written letter and then also by witnesses. He did, at one point he did say that if he could be born in any other country, it would be this one. Yeah. Even though I deplore some of your customs, chief of which is your refusal to drink during meals. So he really did like the American people. He really did like America. And in the darkest days, in those darkest hours, he was always hopeful that America would end up pulling through and that America would help save the world, which of course, as we know now, they did.
You know, and with that, I'm going to draw a comparison between you and Winston Churchill, and that you grew up, you were born in a foreign country, you grew up with a passion for the United States, and you've moved here, and not only have you become an American citizen, but you are also doing everything you can to educate the people who live here on just how special our country is.
Well, that's right, you know, and Churchill and me, now that you've put us together, but so many others as well, Kevin. I mean, there are lots of immigrants that have come to the United States of America that understand it. And you see, just like with everything, until you know something else, or unless you know something else, you're often not going to realize just how wonderful something else is. And I think that's what Churchill saw, that's what I saw, that's what people like Stuart Varney and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Elon Musk, and the list goes on and on and on. We look at America and we see the things that Americans take for granted. We see the dynamism, we see the energy, we see that the waymakers and trailblazers and go-getters are looked after, they're supported. And I look at the relationship that you and I have, and the reality is, Kevin, that you've been a wonderful mentor, a great friend, an amazing support, but the relationship that you and I have probably would never have happened if you and I were living in Australia, because things just don't work, or England, because things just don't work that way. Whereas here, there is this culture of mentorship, of support, of help. A lot of it, I think, emanates from America's robust Christianity. And I think a lot of it emanates from the fact that the government is so small compared to other places that it comes down to the people to actually help each other.
You know, and I try to make this point all the time. American exceptionalism is not built on the reality of our people are more special, because our people are the world's people. The people who live here come from every nation of the world. There is, you know, when you say was an American, that doesn't mean that you are a certain type of person or a certain ethnic background. We're everybody. What makes America exceptional is really our system. It's the Constitution, it's the separation of powers, it's the belief in individual liberty, it's the belief in free markets. It is the education that we give, and it's the Christian, Judeo-Christian underpinnings that make our nation different from any other. It's not the people that are different. We are the same. It's the system.
I couldn't agree more, Kevin. And the only thing I would add to that is that from the system flows the culture, flows the values, flows all of those other things. And I think often people don't make that connection. It's not just the system, it's the culture that the system fosters.
So now you wrote this book, and it talks about the system. Two men that loved America, two men that were charged with leadership to save Western civilization, which is really what we're talking. I think the best of Western civilization is the best of America. I really do. I think they go hand in hand, and America is that great experiment that came out of the Western culture, built on Judeo-Christian values with liberty and all of that. But these two men, you wrote a book about them. Did you come to any striking conclusions that you'd like to share?
Look, Kevin, Winston Churchill was, I think, undoubtedly, although he's got some competition from Albert Einstein and Ronald Reagan and others, but I think that for mine, he was the greatest figure of the 20th century. I think there's a good chance, even though it's much too early to call, that Donald Trump could go down as the greatest figure of the 21st century. I'll go one step further. I think, and again, this is just based on the same gut instinct that I had in January of 2016 when you and I first met, and I predicted, with not much else other than my gut instinct, that Donald Trump would be successful in the primary and then again in November in the election. I think that there's every chance that Donald Trump will actually have a greater impact on history than even Winston Churchill.
Well, I'm so appreciative. We're going to tell our viewers to get a copy of your book. It's out May 19th, and everybody should get a copy, Trump and Churchill, and read
Defenders
it.
of Western Civilization.
Yes. and read it. And so thank you so much, Nick, for joining us here in the Economic War Room.
It's a pleasure, Kevin.
Now, Nick's book is out in stores as of May 19th. I know this man. I've read his other books. I've had him speak. He's spoken at schools, and he is the real deal. He's genuine. He's passionate about America, and you need to read this book because it gives you a new insight as to the current president. I'll tell you, the people during World War II didn't necessarily like Winston Churchill. A lot of them didn't like him. They thought he was rude and crude and boorish and all of these other things, but he was God's man for the hour. He helped save Western civilization. And right now we're facing an entirely new type of crisis. This is the invisible enemy. This is a virus that you can't even see that's crushing economies around the world, that has cost lives, countless lives, and really infected and harmed our civilization and the whole world. We need President Donald Trump to be the man of the hour now, to fight this battle, to win this war. And so you need to get a copy of this book and read it, and we need to find good ways to support. We put together a battle plan. It goes with this episode. It'll feature some of what Nick has said, some excerpts from his book. It'll talk about what we can be doing today to make a real difference in this world, to fight the fight. Now you remember, Winston Churchill had Operation Dynamo. It was the small ships that saved the British Expeditionary Force from the beaches of Dunkirk. But it required the British people to take place, to participate, to be a part of it, to get their little pleasure craft or fishing boat and go across the channel and get the people off the beach and bring them back. Well, we need you. You're a part of the small ships. You need to get the free battle plan that we have at economicwarroom.com and learn about your role in fighting the invisible enemy, but also your role in helping to save Western civilization. Remember, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.